In 2008, that we were invaded by a full-blown Russian force, which involved more than 100,000 ground troops, more than 1,000 armor. We were overall 200 combat planes on the Russian side took part in the operation against basically what was a very small-sized Georgian professional army. And in that respect, first we had mediation by exactly the kind of mediation that you see now with President Hollande and Merkel by President Sarkozy. And he came in, we signed the ceasefire agreement, Georgian army withdrew its forces from the contested area, the invaded area, and Russia was supposed to withdraw as well. Instead, Russia, after several days, said the situation on the ground has changed, they no longer would abide by the agreement, and started to advance over the capital. And what really had stopped back then was the United States proclaiming military humanitarian operation, moving the MACFOL of the 6th Fleet first to the Georgian ports, and putting planes in Romanian base and putting the air base in Turkey on high military alert, and basically starting to patrolling skies close to Georgia. The other day I was at the office of Senator Kirk, who told me that he was back then, I didn't know the story, he was on duty in Pentagon. And actually the United States had to bring back, based on our agreement, because we were the second biggest, or first, in the end, the first biggest per capita contributor to operation out of foreign contributors to Iraq and Afghanistan. But at that moment, it was Iraq. But the agreement we had, the standby agreement with the President of the United States, was that we could repatriate our troops. So what happened that the United States told, first Russians told the United States to remove the military cargo plane from the tarmac of Tbilisi International Airport. The United States refused to do that, and that was already a very first important signal, because they were told they were going to bomb the Tbilisi International Airport, and they didn't want to move American plane. American plane stayed on the tarmac, and that spared us at least that bombing. And second thing, they had to bring back Georgian brigades, and Georgian skies were fully under control of Russian military jets, and they told me they wouldn't let through the U.S. plane. And then the Pentagon, and Senator Kirk told me he called specifically the Russian defense minister and said, "We are coming anyway, this is the U.S. plane, and don't you ever dare to touch us." And they came in and they didn't do it. And that was the key moment when, after this launching of military humanitarian operations, just few miles away from our capital, with Vladimir Putin's clearly proclaimed goal to depose democratically elected government of Georgia, just like they have, I think, more or less proclaimed goal to depose government in Ukraine, they had to stop. And that was a clear sign that stepping up and counting on who would blink first, Putin at that moment blinked first. And I have to say, I strictly believe they will try to depose the government of Ukraine. They will not succeed to do it, but that's clearly their plan. It's not their plan to just hold to those two regions, like it was never planned to hold just to the regions of Georgia. They wanted to get rid of Georgian democracy because that was a dangerous precedent. Exactly like having Ukraine succeed, it would be just very dangerous precedent for Russia. So sometimes, like it took it in Western Berlin, Americans protected West Berlin even from Stalin and Western allies. And they protected it through all the decades of the Cold War. And West Berlin was a showcase of what democracy should look like. And that's really convinced all of us. I mean, we didn't need much of conviction, but they convinced overall the subdued nations that they had to revolt against the communist system. Exactly the same type for today's world. Like Georgia was in 2008, I think Ukraine is West Berlin of today, and it's much more protectable than the West Berlin ever was. And even more protectable than Georgia was, by the way, because Georgia didn't have that strategic depth. That's what the example of Georgia clearly shows. Here I have photos, Senator, and it clearly shows these are the weapons that are only given to Russian special forces. This is highly sophisticated Russian weapons, would never be given to any local rebels. This new, brand new infantry fighting vehicle they have. The artillery launching system here that were spotted in parades inside Russia just 1 year before the invasion, obviously, so that's the regular equipment of the Russian army. But besides, I mean, what we have to keep in mind here, first, Russia, this is the war, as you rightly said, Ambassador Pfeiffer, that Russia doesn't even recognize its fighting. So first they were sending in North Caucasians, mostly Muslim population, with the hope that mainstream Russians would not really care if they die. Now they're mostly sending troops from beyond the Urals, Far East, mostly from many of them from ethnic minority areas from there, and basically are very careful not to send in Muscovites and St. Petersburg people. They had to send them co-airborne in August last year, and there was a political scandal where a number of them have died, and that really spread in Russia. So what it is telling you that Russia, once you raise the cost for Putin's invasion, there is no way he's going to follow up with the stakes, because there is a very thin layer of tolerance Russians have towards human casualties. That's the structure of his troops clearly indicate to you that he's really, in some way here, has very little maneuver. So it's so important to take this decision on the weapons, because that's going to reverse many of the plans he has about that country.
Thank you.
Yeah, on France, I remember that in 2008, when they supplied the Mistral helicopter warships to Russia, when we strongly protested to them because they were guarantors of the ceasefire, some very high-level French officials replied to us rather cynically that they would supply us with missiles to sink Mistrals, no problem with that, if we would like to buy them. So France could be very inventive in this kind of approach. Now in Germany, I saw Chancellor Merkel last month at the European People's Party summit in Brussels, and actually she took the floor initially, and she told me, I know some people at this table want to ease the sanctions. I'm telling you outright, Germany will not support it. And she is the kind of person that certainly leads the sanction movement right now. I don't see Germany, for a number of very historic and psychological reasons, ever supplying lethal equipment, but they've been good on supplying non-lethal. In some other cases, I think that might happen, but I don't think that should be an impediment to the U.S. doing that, because, as I said, there is a moment when only the United States, but the problem with not supplying weapons is of different sort. Right now, and this was the case in the case of Georgia, because there is no signal from Washington, Czechs, Slovaks, Bulgarians, and a number of others are refusing to provide even spare parts from old Soviet equipment to Ukraine, precisely for the reason because they don't want to stay alone if Washington is not on board. So Washington, by not supplying lethal weapons, is also blocking the others from doing it, because that has really become this cornerstone right now. We are at the crossroads, and it's really becoming very counterproductive. And finally, on sanctions. Now, new sanctions are always helpful, but there is a moment after which only sanctions can also cause lots of risk, because what might happen that Putin, by having the sanctions might think, I have very little time left, I better seize the rest of it, go for it, and then, of course, from the position of strength, negotiate my way out of sanctions, because Europeans will not send sanctions anyway for a long time. And after some time, they'll come back to me. So there is a moment when only sanctions, might be even not as helpful as before, because you need something else. Well, Senator, you're absolutely right that there was U.S. guarantee, first of all, for Budapest Memorandum. One of the things I omitted to mention was that the Ukraine also gave, on U.S. insistence, manpads. They don't even have manpads, because the United States strongly insisted they follow up on their promise not only on nuclear warheads, but they also gave thousands of manpads, which they now really need in that situation. So, yeah, on international coalition, certainly I agree with Mr. Wilson. There are countries that are very much on board, but they are right now basically they are standing by because they want for Washington to lead. There is no way they can do something on their own. I still would imagine Poland might risk doing something on their own, but for the others, I wouldn't bet on that. But once there is a signal coming from Washington, I'm sure there will be a strong coalition also on supplying weapons. And one thing we should know also, there are a number of people, nationals from these countries, including my nation, that are fighting like volunteers on the side of Ukrainian army. We have Georgian officers dying for them there. We are proud that we're part of the operations in ISAF and the others. We had lots of people that died in Afghanistan and Iraq fighting alongside of the Americans. But also now many of the people that went to Afghanistan with the Americans, went to Iraq, they are fighting in Ukraine. We have basically a couple of hundred Georgians from those operations that also went through the training, now fighting there. There you also see Poles there. You see countries from people from Baltic countries. So there is already a coalition of citizens of the nations around Ukraine fighting for Ukraine because they understand that's also their battle. There is also lots of sympathy in those nations. But for that, you need for these countries to get together, you need a empowerment from Washington. And I'm sure there will be countries that will be American allies on military front. Nobody is asking for American boots on the ground. That's out of question. Ukraine has enough fighting manpower. There are people who will stand up for their nation. But also, and there will be other countries that will be on this kind of second rank, like Germany, that might not be part of these large-scale military efforts, but they certainly were an important component of the sanctions list. So I think there is an overwhelming sympathy towards Ukraine, and I don't see this falling apart unless something dramatic and bad signal comes from Washington. Senator, last March, when the whole thing had already started, I've been telling some of the administration officials, why don't you try to start at least training? You know, there is framework for training. They told me we don't have enough time. Now, Russia has done since then 6 or 7 rounds of training of the so-called separatist troops. What it indicates to you, lots of time has been lost. We know from Georgian experience, Americans are very good at training. You put Marines or some other troops on the ground, they can train full brigade within 4 or 5 weeks. Remember, the other point for U.S. training is that you now have you don't have this kind of disorganized troops when you have U.S. trained soldiers that might be used for all kind of bad means, like either moving against the legitimate government. When you have U.S. element present, that also brings lots of stability to constitutional systems of democracies. That's one of the beauties of the U.S. training. And Ukraine also needs as this kind of stability as badly as it needs help with defending itself, because what Russia's plan is, to inflict defeat on the Ukrainians. That's their hope, and then send back disorganized troops to do some nasty things back in Kiev. And that will never work if U.S. training is already installed in place. And by the way, I already have a list that the Ukrainian government has submitted to the U.S., which is really required and needed. And that list has been circulated quite a long. The U.S. government knows what is needed. It has been done after long consultation with unofficial ones, with people on Pentagon. So it's not like they're coming. By the way, I think it's very modest. I looked at the list. It looks really modest. It includes also some anti-tank TOW Javelin missiles, but it's really, the numbers are so modest. And in terms of money, it's really not much. What is really expensive, Ukrainians have. They have anti-air, they have heavy artillery, they have all sorts of other things. It's not a matter of money, it's a matter of political will right now. That, first of all, the idea of this hearing, obviously, is what will happen next. And I can tell you, I met with Putin dozens of times. He always told me 3 things consistently: that he was menacing us with invasion. He will always mention that Ukraine is not a real country, it's just a territory. And third, he always said that Baltic countries are not defendable. He always says beforehand what he wants. People have heard her, and it's very clear that if he gets away with Ukraine, then Baltic countries which don't have either strategic depth or manpower of Ukrainians, they just rely on U.S. Article 5 guarantees, which is an important stuff, but still, I mean, there are many vulnerabilities that they have, even more than Ukrainians ever had. That's very clear that he will continue on, because that's the only way how he sees he can maintain power inside Russia. Now, when we called about this 80% ratings, we should realize that this is a fear rating. This is not really a popular rating. People tend to measure it with the measurements of democracies, and doesn't work this way in this kind of systems. I think North Korean leader has even higher ratings, and doesn't mean that So what it means is that basically, people have been saying, well, Russians can stand just any sanctions. That's a history of Russia. And I think this is not true, simply because Russia has never had such a strong middle class. This is a combination, first, of the U.S. assistance, bailing out the Russian economy in the 90s, which really was the decisive factor. And then, of course, the oil price and redistributing inside Russia. This middle class has always lived with expanding living standards. They are not used to living with declining living standards. Nobody has seen them. So it makes Putin to panic. It makes Putin to make mistakes and to become more aggressive. So there is, and I think shale gas, generally U.S. shale gas, is the single most important factor in what have brought the oil thing and what brought him into this panic mode. What U.S. did with its legal system, which doesn't happen in Europe, is that in Europe you can, manipulate some environmental groups and others block local shale production, because it's whatever is underground, it's basically belongs to the state. Here it belongs to the person who owns the land, and that makes the U.S. system so much more open to this kind of enterprises, entrepreneurial thing. So that's really changed the whole logic of the event. Suddenly, good guys have energy, bad guys have lower money for their energy. So from that standpoint, it's absolutely decisive factor. I think it's a matter of not many years that the thing is diverse. There is a physical fatigue. You cannot, every leader, even the most autocratic one, has his time span. I think Chinese have been smarter with that. They have been changing faces of their leaders, and they had a more flexible system. Here, this is a one-man show. You know, everything, there is no other political actor. He played around a little bit with Medvedev idea, it's gone. Now it's him. You know, every credit is taken by him, every blame goes to him. And that's a very dangerous system for no matter which politician. From that standpoint, I'm very optimistic. I think Russian people are well-read people, they're well-traveled people. They certainly want to be respected internationally, although until now they had it both ways. They were getting, you know, playing around in the neighborhood, they were being nasty, and at the same time they still kept some kind of resemblance of respect. Now those two are not compatible, and people will understand it. And again, going back, I fully agree with Stefan, the Afghan syndrome is a very important one. I was in the Soviet Union. I remember that. They certainly had, you know, I remember what a combination of low oil prices and manpads did. Until low oil prices, it wouldn't have worked. But now you had low oil prices, suddenly Soviet budgetary income went down, and then manpads reversed the logic on the ground. That's exactly what we have now. We have lower oil and gas prices, and we just need some javelins to, or some other things, whatever Ukrainians will be requesting, to change the cost equation. After all, the cost equation matters. Maybe find it more, maybe even not for Putin, but for the Russians overall, Russian public. Whatever elite is left there, security apparatus, it will certainly make lots of difference. And that's my main hope. Thank you. I want to speak about pilot Nadezhda Savchenko that is basically held, what was kidnapped. She's a military pilot, was active participant of the Maidan protests. And she was kidnapped from the Ukrainian territory, brought into Russia. She's now held in Moscow. And she's on basically in a grave medical condition because she has been going through hunger strike. And, you know, there are many Ukrainians like that sacrifice their life. And the remarkable story of Ukraine is not just heroism on the battlefield, which was very obvious. You know, these are the troops that were backward technologically. For 10 years or so, they were just plundering everything, giving up everything through legal means, but also illegal means. There was lots of corruption, while Russia was building up things. So that really came into battle totally taken by surprise, unprepared, untrained, and still they, against all the odds, they were holding for a long time against the overwhelming Russian forces, are still continuing to do so. Now, the important thing to understand there is that these people, there is also another aspect to it. Most of these efforts of the Ukrainian army has been done also by volunteers. Basically, supply of the troop, medical supplies, even the military supplies and the bulletproof vests, you know, there have been thousands and tens of thousands, and in case of money, millions of Ukrainians contributing. It's not just war of Putin versus Poroshenko or, you know, like some against Ukrainian government. It's Putin's war against multi-ethnic Ukrainian nation. The other thing people don't really know here is that most of these troops fighting and protecting Ukraine are Russian speakers. And basically, a big part of them are ethnic Russians. This is not an ethnic issue. This is not a, you know, this is not a regional issue. This is not, as I said, government-to-government issue. This is the multi-ethnic, multicultural nation of Ukraine trying to defend its freedom, its values, and its ideals. And the whole society is part of it because, as I said, the government was almost bankrupt. And you had people volunteering and basically supplying most of the things they are getting there. And I don't know any other country in the world where basically this number of volunteer part for the population had been engaged in what was basically an all-around national campaign for this nation's survival. And that's something to be considered for all of us because, you know, again, as I said, I told you about Georgian volunteers fighting there. Basically, most of them, you know, they are not there for money. They are not really paid anything. But whatever they are supplied with, these are given by ordinary Ukrainians. This is not the government that gives them. Well, I have just to add that besides 17 billions, overall pledge is 40 billions. For the reform package. It's very important that the United States, we are trying to now jumpstart the reforms, but it's very important that also this committee and generally overall the U.S. Congress pays greater attention. We need more CODELs coming, and specifically not on the only with the focus on military issue, which is an urgent issue because it has become tantamount to the symbol of whether Ukraine is abandoned or not. But beyond that, what's really is needed, real crackdown on corruption, real economic changes, really for the ordinary Ukrainians to see the difference. And from that standpoint, from our own experience in Georgia, the U.S. standing by the idea of reform, steering it in the right direction, giving incentives, giving praise when necessary, and sometimes offer friendly criticism when it's also necessary. It's absolutely key for reformers inside Ukraine to overcome what has been there for decades, this vested interests of plundering and basically robbing that's quite potentially very rich nation with very smart people and very talented people. And I think this is the best parliament they ever had right now. It's really more clean of the vested interests than any previous legislatures. So it's very easy to work with these parliamentarians. Many of them are quite inexperienced, so they need to be introduced also to the U.S. system. You need to bring them here as well. You need to get to know them. I think that reminds me of what we were like this in mid-90s. And I remember I was young parliamentarian back in '96, fresh from GW law school here. And I remember us coming back every 3, 4, 5, 6 months, together with a bunch of younger parliamentarians, not just to talk to you or ask for help, but to learn, to get educated, to exchange ideas. That was absolutely the single strongest factor behind Georgian democracy somehow getting stronger and also communicate to the people. And I think Ukraine needs this more than ever. And I think your role here is decisive. I think this hearing also has a key role to play for that.
Saakashvili, final
Yes. Senator, I wanted to thank you for this hearing as well. We have now live feed to many Ukrainian television channels. It's a country of more than 40 million people, and I think many of them will be watching what's being said in the U.S. Congress and this committee. More than that, in Georgia it's being watched, in Moldova it's being watched. There in Georgia I have a Saakashvili Presidential Library, and they actually, after midnight, and I was just told by my assistant there is a full hall of there assembled watching it live on television. And that can tell you that people showing up at so late at night trying to watch this together, what kind of impact these kind of events have in our part of the world. And this one side of India. The other part of it is that Putin never made secret that he's not after Poroshenko or just after any of us. He's after the United States. He has said it publicly many times. He's depicted his confrontation as confrontation with the United States. So even if some elements in the U.S. would not want to be part of it, but from Putin's point of view, they are, and he is striking at the U.S. interest. So from that standpoint, it's very important that with all the moral support the people have been getting, especially from this building and from your committee and from your personally, Senator, they now finally get also the ultimate decisions, because those decisions are going to make will have, besides like very concrete changes on the ground, huge moral boosting effect, because in this kind of confrontations, it's very important, I know it from our experience, to know that you are on the right side. So again, thank you, Senator, for being on the right side today, together with other members of the committee, and thank you for all your support and your impact and your contribution.